Are Americans racist against Russians? Your first answer is probably no. Of course not. Russians are white. But first of all, 75% of Russia is in Asia, and many Russians are literally Asian. Second of all, just because you might look white doesn't necessarily mean that's all there is to it. For example, Irish people didn't originally count as whites in America, and racist stuff also happened to Italians, Greeks, Jews, basically any of the new immigrants of the early 1900s. But what about Russian Americans? Russians are always the bad guys in Hollywood movies. It might be stylish, but how is that not racist? Even in video games, Russians are always the enemy. So why is it okay to hate on Russians? Let's find out. Most people have never heard of the Palmer Raids. In 1919, the U.S. government was scared Russians would take over the country and authorized mass arrests of anyone who might be an anarchist. Over 10,000 people were jailed throughout the country, and 249 Russian immigrants were deported. Most had no warrant, and many were arrested just because they had an accent. Russians and Americans were friends in World War II, but when the Russians finally built their own nukes, the Cold War began. In 1952, the U.S. made it illegal for people to visit from Soviet countries. From 53 to 54, only 33 Soviet citizens traveled to the U.S. for official government business. If you were a Russian living in America during that time, you would be an easy target for someone to accuse you of being there illegally. By 1957, 1/3 of the United States was declared off limits to any travelers from Russia, including the entire state of Washington. Anyone even slightly Russian-ish or friendly towards Russians was suspected of being a spy. You could be stopped by the police, held prisoner by the FBI, fired from your job, and ostracized from society in general. The less Russian you could seem, the better off you'd be. But what about today? The war in Ukraine became a media sensation in 2022, and a lot of people have been taking it out on Russian Americans. Andrei Melishkov, for example, was stabbed with a broken beer bottle by someone who thought he was Russian, even though he's actually from Ukraine. Russian-American businesses have been targets for hate crimes too. For example, Pushkin Restaurant in San Diego received a flood of hate mail, death threats, and bad Yelp reviews, supposedly in support of Ukraine.
They were yelling at us, talking about that, we killed their family, and that there will be repercussions towards us. We had people call and say they would bomb us.
Some business owners even changed their business names to sound less Russian. For example, Hustle Customs in Los Angeles used to be called Russian Wraps. It's like, come on guys, don't you realize that maybe these people left their home country because they don't support Russian politics? But why does it still seem like there's no such thing as racism against Russians? Well, for one thing, there basically aren't any photos of what happened during the Palmer Raids, and the few rare photos that do exist all suck. They really don't show you how messed up this part of American history was. Take this photo, for example. It's an office for the New York IWW, an international labor union, and the target of the FBI. You see a room that's been trashed, with furniture thrown around and paper everywhere. But what you don't see are the broken bones and black eyes of the people whose lives were also trashed by the police. There's not a single person in this picture, and without context, you would have no idea that it's important at all. Here's another. A couple guys wearing trench coats exit a vehicle, gently escorted by a man in a button-up and a snazzy hat. A small crowd watches calmly to the side. It doesn't look urgent. It looks like these guys just got out of a taxi, not arrested for eating borscht. The only detail in this photo that's even slightly sinister is the wire cage on the windows of the vehicle. The photo really doesn't convey the significance of what's happening. Here we see a group of Russian men on Ellis Island waiting to be deported, but they're lounging on benches in their warm coats and cozy hats. None of them look particularly worried or stressed out. You can't even see any of their facial expressions to begin with. They look relaxed, bored, more like they're waiting for a train. It really makes an exciting book cover. Besides, the newspapers weren't trying to tell everyone what a horrible thing was happening to Russians. No, the newspapers were reporting on the Palmer Raids like it was a good thing. They featured photos of Attorney General Mitchell Palmer like he was a hero. None of the photos we have of the Palmer Raids do justice to what actually happened, and the topic is usually overlooked in history books. Racism in America is complicated, and it goes deeper than whether or not you look white. Don't get me wrong, everyone loves a good Russian spy thriller, but the next time you go to the movies and see that yet again the bad guy has a Russian accent, feel free to point at the screen and say, "That's racist."